By socialist thinkers, he rolling with leaders. He know they gon' keep up, stand up for rights of indigenous people. Hip hop is lethal, necessary evil, lethal. You know that's my ego. So
good evening and welcome again to Adelante, Tucson, Tucson's new platform for political analysis. I am your host, Zaira Olivier.
And I am your co-host, Joel Garcia. Today we'll be taking an in-depth look at the history of the neoliberal ideology which lies at the core of U.S. imperialism. This will give us a more thorough understanding of U.S. foreign policy as it relates to the current immigration crisis. We will discuss everything from the implementation of the North American Free Trade Agreement to U.S. military interventions throughout the world, and also how the current xenophobic policies of massive criminalization and persecution of undocumented immigrants have become the dominating social norm.
Okay, so let's get started. Let's first begin by defining neoliberalism. The ideology that dominates our lives has, for the most of us, no name. Mention it in conversation and you'll be rewarded with a shrug. Even if your listeners have heard the term before, they will struggle to define it. Its anonymity is both a symptom and a cause of its power. It has played a major role in a remarkable variety of crises: the financial meltdown of 2007, the offshoring of wealth and power, of which the Panama Papers offer us merely a glimpse, the slow collapse of public health and education, resurgent child poverty, the epidemic of loneliness, and the collapse of the ecosystem, the rise of Donald Trump. But we respond to these crises as if they emerge in isolation, apparently unaware that they all have been either catalyzed or exacerbated by the same coherent philosophy. So persuasive has neoliberalism become that we seldom even recognize it as an ideology. We appear to accept the proposition as a neutral force, a kind of natural law. But the philosophy arose as a conscious attempt to reshape human life and shift the locus of power.
Further, attempts to limit competition are treated as an attack to liberty. Tax and regulation should be minimized. Public services should be privatized. The organization of labor and collective bargaining by trade unions are portrayed as market distortions that impede the formation of a natural hierarchy of winners and losers. Inequality is recast as virtuous, a reward for utility and a generator of wealth, which trickles down to enrich everyone. Efforts to create a more equal society are both counterproductive and morally corrosive. The market ensures that everyone gets what they deserve. We internalize and reproduce its creeds. The rich persuade themselves that they acquired their wealth through merit, ignoring the advantages such as education, inheritance, and class that may have helped to secure it. The poor begin to blame themselves for their failures, even when they can do little to change their circumstances. Never mind structural unemployment. If you don't have a job, it's because you are unenterprising or lazy. Never mind the impossible costs of housing. Never mind that your children no longer have a school playing field. If they gain weight, it's your fault. In a world governed by competition, those who fall behind become defined as self-defined losers. This is neoliberalism.
The term neoliberalism was coined at a meeting in Paris in 1938. Among the delegates were Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek, both exiles from Austria. They saw social democracy exemplified by FDR's New Deal and the gradual development of Britain's welfare state as manifestations of a collectivism on par with Nazism. In The Road to Serfdom, published in 1944, Hayek argued that the government planning by crushing individualism would lead to a totalitarian control. This popular book came to the attention of some very wealthy people who saw in the philosophy an opportunity to free themselves from regulation and tax. In 1947, Hayek founded the first organization that would spread the doctrine of neoliberalism, the Mont Pelerin Society, which was supported financially by millionaires and their foundations.
With their help, he began to create a kind of neoliberal international, a transatlantic network of academics, businessmen, journalists, and activists. The movement's rich backers funded a series of think tanks which would refine and promote the ideology. Among them were the American Enterprise Institute, the Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute, the Institute of Economic Affairs, the Center for Policy Studies, and the Adam Smith Institute. As it evolved, neoliberalism became more strident, and the belief that monopoly power could be seen as a reward for efficiency began to take hold. It was during this shift that the movement lost its name. Stranger still, even as the movement became more coherent, the lost name was not replaced by any common alternative. At first, neoliberalism remained at the margins. The post-war consensus was almost universal. Full employment and the relief of poverty were common goals in the United States and much of Western Europe. Top rates of tax were high, and governments sought social outcomes without embarrassment, developing new public services and safety nets. But in the 1970s, with the Keynesian policies began to fall apart and economic crisis struck on both sides of the Atlantic, neoliberal ideas began to enter the mainstream. With the help of sympathetic journalists and political advisors, elements of neoliberalism were adopted by Jimmy Carter's administration in the United States and Jim Callaghan's government in Britain.
After Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan took over, the rest followed. Massive tax cuts for the rich, the crushing of trade unions, deregulation, privatization, outsourcing and competition in public services. Through the IMF and the World Bank and the Maastricht Treaty and the World Trade Organization, neoliberal policies were imposed, often without democratic consent, on much of the world. Most remarkable was the adoption among parties that once belonged to the left. This includes Labor and also the Democratic Party, for example. So in order to understand how these catastrophic neoliberal policies have completely devastated Latin American economies, contributing to the detriment of these societies and provoking the current immigration humanitarian crisis we see at our borders today, we must take a closer look at North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA. This agreement was signed by the Clinton administration in 1994 as a trilateral trade agreement between Canada, the US, and Mexico, seeking to eliminate barriers to trade and investment between the three countries. The agreement was sold by capitalist economists and politicians as a measure to bring about economic growth for all three countries and to prevent immigration. Yet after 20 years, we can confirm that the results were exactly the opposite.
For example, since the implementation of NAFTA, the Mexican agricultural market has been flooded by cheaper U.S. subsidized corn, forcing Mexican corn production to fall by over 56%. This has put thousands of Mexican farmers out of business and has ejected over 2 million peasants from their lands. As a result, over 42% of the food that is now consumed in Mexico has been imported, and this reflects how the food sovereignty of Mexico has been deeply severed. As a consequence of this trade agreement, the poverty rate in Mexico has skyrocketed to over 22 million, which is around 20% of the population. So what has been the outcome of this economic agreement? Well, the fact remains that between 1992 and 2011, the amount of undocumented immigrants crossing into the United States increased from 3.9 million to 11.1 million. After decades under violent U.S.-backed dictatorships and following the successful example of the Cuban Revolution in 1959, Central American struggles for liberation gained unprecedented momentum. In the 1980s, the United States funded and trained bloodthirsty right-wing governments in order to suppress national struggles for self-determination. At the time, in El Salvador, the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front, a people's national liberation movement, was fighting against notorious notorious right-wing state death squads, more specific, the Atlacatl Battalion, which was trained to dismantle guerrilla support by means of inhumane state terror tactics, coincidentally trained at the United States School of the Americas, now called the Western Hemisphere Institute for Security and Cooperation. These death squads were responsible for the deaths of over 70,000 people.
The U.S.-backed right-wing government of Guatemala also repressed their people with brutal emphasis on mass killings of Mayan people. Still to this day, Guatemalan military officials are being charged with war crimes and genocide of indigenous peoples. There were over 200,000 known deaths in Guatemala alone during this period. A fascist government also existed in Honduras, where U.S. Army presence was especially heavy, as Honduras was the base for U.S. operations in Central America in the 1950s. For instance, when the Sandinistas in Nicaragua succeeded in overthrowing the Somoza dictatorship in 1979, the exiled fled and trained with the U.S. military in Honduras in order to form the Contras, a group intent on counter-revolution. The U.S.-backed Contras caused misery, assassinations, and disappearances in attempts to sabotage the leftist Nicaraguan government. As a result, the U.S. has witnessed massive waves of Central American refugees since the 90s, as people continue to flee from war and violence. In the past 4 years alone, over 50,000 refugee children have fled from Central America countries and crossed into the U.S. border.
It is important to mention that imperialist need for war and destruction is tied to the profits gained by corporations and banks involved in the military-industrial complex. More recently, the war in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and Syria are wars of occupation which only seek to the strategic geopolitical control of the region, its resources and markets. These occupations continue to destabilize and destroy countries and are completely responsible for the refugee crisis that currently confronts European countries. With over 11 million undocumented immigrants currently in the United States, our government has chosen to pursue massive internal repressive policies to criminalize, persecute, incarcerate, and deport millions of immigrants who overwhelmingly just seek family reunification and the opportunity to a better future. Laws like Arizona's SB 1070 have made racial profiling completely legal. At the same time, federal judicial programs like Operation Streamline, started by the Department of Homeland Security in 2005, and which denied due process, fair legal representation, and imposed coerced plea deals, are driven by the criminal for-profit private prison industry, which seek to profit millions of dollars out of the inhumane incarceration of undocumented immigrants. These types of immigration policies have made illegal entry the most prosecuted federal crime. Likewise, the militarization of the border follows the deceitful policy of prevention through deterrence, forcing migrants to cross over deadly desert terrain. The annual budget for the Department of Homeland Security stands at a staggering $12.4 billion, That is taxpayer money that is being utilized to finance low-intensity warfare against our immigrant brothers and sisters.
Since the election of Trump, and with the revitalization of white supremacy in the country, we have seen an intensification in not only anti-immigrant rhetoric, but also in the legal and political persecution of undocumented immigrants. We have seen DACA suspended, leaving close to 1 million people without the ability to go to work, to go to school, and to pay taxes. We continue to see Muslim immigrants being targeted and prevented from legally entering the United States. Fascist programs such as the Victims of Immigration Crime Engagement, or VOICE, recently announced by Trump, are setting the stage for measures of persecution against undocumented immigrants. Previous executive orders by the new president have also increased the number of ICE and Border Patrol agents, as well as threats to defund cities which are committed to protecting and defending undocumented immigrants. And that, folks, is neoliberalism in a nutshell, an ideology that lives quietly at the roots of all of our problems. Did you have anything else to add, Juan?
No, just thank you all for listening very much. Enjoy the week.
Yes, and join us next week. Please share our show, and we'll see you Tuesday at 5.
No bourgeoisie, young check and borrow, chip check and borrow, chip check and borrow. No bourgeoisie, young check and borrow. Fight back, tell the pro.